Computer, okay. Hello, everybody. So this is a conversation between Rose and myself, where we were discussing in Slack feedback around the career development framework. Specifically, how do we structure things like competencies and behaviors? Do we differentiate? Do we group things? And so we decided we'll have a quick synchronous conversation to discuss this further and maybe see if we can come up with some better kind of like way forward. I'll start by sharing some context that led to this conversation. So I nominated myself to try out the new career development framework competencies that we developed. And so because I was due to do career development with my team members, and so I said, okay, we need to try this out, and I'll offer to have a look at it. What I then did, and I'll share my screen so this is on in the recording as well, is I had a look at all the kind of like career development competencies that we have at GitLab. Looking both at the company-wide ones, which are the values and remote competencies, as well as the engineering-specific ones that we worked on. And for those who aren't familiar, what we've worked on is to have like a cascading effect. So we'll have some competencies at the engineering level, and then at the development level. And in this example, for instance, I've got a team member who's a backend engineer in dev. So there's some competencies there as well. What ended up becoming quite apparent quickly is that there is a lot of behaviors defined. Initially it was close to 90. I picked up that we had some duplication between engineering and dev on the leadership, engineering and development on the leadership front. And so I've already submitted an MR to clean that up, but we still have a lot of behaviors. There's like 85 in total. And the initial kind of like response when I took team members through this was, wow, this is a lot. Yeah. And it was overwhelming. And that made me think like, this doesn't feel right. These things are all, individually looking at the wording and things, they all make sense, and these are good things. But what I started thinking about was, are we getting too granular in these things? We've had feedback previously that the career framework felt a lot like a checkbox exercise. You're having to tick things off, and I was like feeling, maybe we're getting into that space again, because we have a whole bunch of things here. And how do we make sense of this? How do I take what is here and effectively manage that with a team member and help them evaluate themselves against these things that we've defined that we want to see in, for instance, in this example, a senior backend engineer in dev. So I had a conversation with my mentor, and we discussed. I explained the challenge I have, and then he proceeded to explain to me how they go about it. How he goes about it, and similar to what we have, where we have these kind of like categories of values and remote and technical competency and leadership. They have similar broad categories. And what they've done is in those categories, they define outcomes that they would like somebody to see. Now, an outcome could be something as simple as, be an effective communicator. And that is, what we probably consider a competency of someone. And they would have this outcome across levels. So let's say across junior, intermediate, senior staff, and manager, whatever the levels are, they would have that as something that they want to see in a person, even in the juniors. However, what they then do is they define the behaviors that they expect from the different levels against this outcome. So, as an effective communicator at a junior level, it might be that you need to be effectively communicating to your manager. At a senior level, you need to be effectively communicating across the team, and so forth. And as a manager, you need to communicate effectively across teams, as an example. this kind of like resonated with me, in the sense of we have all these kind of like behaviors in a way that we've defined, act as a coach for open source contributors, able to work with third-party services regardless of the quality of documentation. These all feel like behaviors of something that we want somebody to be, under technical competency. And so my thinking and initial feedback that I gave to the working group is that I don't feel like this list that we have here is implementable just as is. Like I'm struggling to conceptualize how do I effectively work with a team member with this list? How do I make this engaging for them and also not overwhelming? I mentioned I asked my mentor, for instance, what would you say is a maximum number of competencies or outcomes that somebody should evaluate themselves against? And he said probably between 10 and 15. And that kind of like made me think, okay, we probably have a mixture in here of competencies / behaviors that, and like I said, I think what we have here is right, but we probably just need to group or package it better, and then maybe discuss, and this is something that initially we left out of the working group criteria, to say we don't need to define the tooling necessarily to implement the framework. We were mostly concerned with the individual kind of like line items. But my feedback is that having the line items in front of me, I'm struggling to relate this into how I effectively manage this with my team members. And that's kind of like what started this conversation, where I'm saying, I think we need to look at reworking the structure potentially of the content that we have here and how we go about managing that with our team members.
Yes, thanks for laying this out. I must admit, it's indeed a lot. If I look at them, I think it's a lot, and I wonder, like, to what extent do you think? So I think categorizing is a good idea. So we could make indeed like competencies which have outcomes, of course. So indeed, like, hey, we want to be, so effective communication is a competency. The outcome should be that you're an effective communicator, and this is what that looked like, right? And I wonder if to what extent the values part of development is overlapping with the values part, which is defined by the company. Like, is that the case? Because I wonder, and this might be an open question, do we need specific values, competencies in development?
Yeah, this is something that I actually started looking at as well. I think a lot of what is written for the values in here came from the original career matrix that we have.
Matrix.
And I think that predates having the company defined competencies, like it's recently been added to the spec. And so my view is that we should not have development specific values in here. I think we need to align with the company values and say that is it. Yeah. And if there are things in here that we'd like to see as behaviors, we should put it in the right category of the outcomes that we want people to share. So yeah. I'm in agreement that I think the values for development should go away, and we should align with the company values. That doesn't mean these things aren't valuable, but I think overall they're adding too much over to the process. And I think my understanding is that trying to get to the values competencies being company-wide and adopting a company-wide.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the same for the remote working competencies as well, which we defined. Because, and what's actually funny is that we looked at the existing career development framework, or the competency framework of development, to come to the company-wide competencies. So I think we did some crosswork here, because we just looked at, so when we were in this effective efficiency a project group, we said, okay, we need to determine company competencies, and these all need to be having a training aligned, right? So, and then we actually looked at, okay, what do we already have? And then we saw in development and also in customer support that we already had a sort of a framework. So we went based off of that. So actually, I think there should be, that would be a part which we can take out and say, okay, we could really bring this down to, I think I have the page open of competencies, and if I look at it, so each value has one competency for each level. So that would already narrow the first part down, and as well the remote working competencies down too, because there's 4. I think it's being a manager of one. So I think that would already crop it, and then we can look at at column A and say like, okay, but this is really development, functional, or engineering specific, which needs to be in there. But else we could like sort of simplify the first values and the remote working competencies.
Yeah. So to your point, you've got it right there. I must actually move this column here. So under the remote category, there's actually only 4 competencies: manager of one, effective communication, handbook first, and using GitLab. And the lines here that I have in column B is actually the behaviors. And this is the cleanest example almost of my view of how we should be grouping it. Is we've got a category, remote. We've got a competency saying, we expect you to be a manager of one. And what does being a manager of one mean? It means take responsibility to complete tasks and goals within appropriate timelines, delivers on commitments, drive issue-based discussions, highlight areas. So this gives you an example of what it means to be a manager of one. This does not mean it's the beginning and end of what being a manager of one is. These are example behaviors, and that we give for you to understand what we mean. You could be exhibiting something else potentially that also speaks to manager of one. And so and this is now going a little bit more practical, and it's like, how do we communicate this with team members? I would say, okay, at a senior level, you should you need to, we expect you as company-wide to be a manager of one as part of our remote working focus. And these are the behaviors that, that speaks to being a senior in manager of one. Let's talk around, how you're exhibiting these behaviors. But what we should absolutely not do is to say, okay, you're doing this, you're doing this one, you're doing that one, and kind of like treat it as a checkbox. We should be speaking at the level of the competency, which is, okay, are you a manager of one? Are you exhibiting some of the behaviors of being a manager of one? Where are you lacking? What can we focus on? And I think a lot of this is merely just packaging and communicating it properly. But I feel we've stopped short, and purposefully so, as a working group, of defining how we package things and how we communicate. And we've said, let's try out these behaviors with the team members. And I think what I'm finding is that stopping short of going that extra step is stopping too far from where we should be before we can effectively roll this out to the rest of engineering.
Yeah, I think maybe what's good to share. Can I share my screen real quick? Because yes, if we look at this page, for example, we looked at, so this is the company-wide competencies page, and here it says we have this is a structure, but we have values competencies, which all have one for each level, which all have one behavior of each level, and the remote working competencies here. And then you have like functional competencies, right? Which is also like the leadership and technical part. And I think what we've tried to come up with is sort of a framework saying like, okay, as a senior, you're showing being a manager of one in your cross-functional work, for example, instead of only showing that on your own work, right? That's more of the associate or within the team is more of the intermediate level. So this is sort of how we try to fix that in the company-wide competencies. So that could be, so you could sort of also have these, with communicating this out, you could also say like to what level, what is the scope of impact for each level. And then you can just have examples of behaviors. So then it doesn't really make a checklist, right? Which what we're constantly worried about, I think. So that could sort of help. But I think this is, well, we're just talking here, right? So yeah. This is maybe good for others in the working group also to consider and maybe share thoughts on what we have just discussed.
Yeah, I found that the structure we've started putting in place for the company-wide values and remote competencies make sense for me, and I think we need to make sure that the engineering ones that we're developing follow a similar structure. I think that right now it doesn't feel consistent to me. For instance, if you know, I'll share my screen quickly again, but if I go down to technical competency across engineering, development, and dev, for instance, like I can't necessarily identify what is the competency we want to see. Like these for me feel more like behaviors than they are competencies. We talk about coaching others. We talk about mentoring. There is essentially similar things, and so what we're actually stating is a bunch of behaviors here. I think what we need to do is more look at competencies and then group these behaviors underneath those, which will give us a more condensed kind of like framework to work with, which is what I think is where we need to go next.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense if we can group them. Yeah.
Okay.
Good. All right. Shall we leave this to the group also to decide?
Thank you very much for the conversation. I'll upload this and we'll share it with the rest of the working group to review and maybe share their thoughts on it as well with us.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rose. Bye-bye.